The name is definitely the key. Abbreviation.
So, welcome everyone to the Mmusic session here at IETF 102 in Montreal. I am Bo Burman, and beside me is my co-chair, Flemming Andreasen. We want to make you aware of the note well. If you haven't seen it before, we suggest you read it through. Sorry?
Is this the old one?
I hope not.
I don't think so.
Well,
It's got we'll take it at the end of the resume.
was it in the restaurant? Where's the old design?
The page, if you go on and link to download the page, you get the old design with the new text.
Okay.
Jonathan and this group.
No, that's funny. I have no idea what we're using. But it's like,
We'll double check anyhow. For the administrivia, we should pass out the blue sheets. Please sign them. And we have a JavaScribe, Jonathan. And we have Ronnie Evan as note taker. Yeah, feel free to help Ronnie on the Etherpad. So thank you for that. And the usual stuff, when you speak, use the microphone and state your name. And we have the beautiful pink square beside the chairs. Please keep within that and you will help the meet echo. As a general request, we ask that you help out with reviewing documents. If you have your own documents that you wish see taken forward and progressed in the working group, please help also others with reviews. For the agenda, we have, besides the chair status update, we have two agenda items. We have Christer talking about the offer answer considerations, about SDP extensions, and we have ISIP SDP draft relation to DNS, MDNS host names. So any comments or suggestions for the agenda? If not, we go further with the working group status. Mmusic did not publish any RFCs since last meeting, but we have 4 more drafts now in the RFC editor's queue, the ones marked in blue on screen, which means that we have quite a bit of drafts in that queue, and some of them for quite a bit of time.
what are they blocked on?
Sorry?
What are they blocked on? Yeah, no, what is the best that giant one? What is most of these? Oh, empty.
Many of them are the famous C238 cluster.
Yeah, just wondering what the last things in the misref were. I heard FlexFac. Is there something besides FlexFac also?
All right, yeah, so it's
The dependency graph is large and confusing, but roughly the things that are still in working groups that it's blocked on are ISIP SDP, flexible FEC in payload, and the WebRTC security architecture document. I'm surprised that RID is marked as blocked. I'm going to go look at that.
And we just want to call out, Bundle finally made it through. So round of applause for Christer especially.
So apart from those laying in the RFC editors queue, we have a small set of drafts in working group consensus. We have the SDP neg, which saw quite a lot of changes. couple of recent versions. So the question is if people would like to see another working group last call for that, or if they are happy with the changes that were made based on comments as part of the previous last call, even though it has been quite some time.
Ronnie Evan, I think most of the changes are of editorial nature. It's more like getting it up to date according to current procedure about registration, SDP offer answer. There are not technical changes in the document, but and I think it's almost ready. Just need to verify that the latest changes are address all the comments. But if you want to do a Q plus call, it's up to you. I mean, it's your decision.
I can leave it up to the working group present in the room. If there are no objections, I suggest that we continue with regular procedures as part of the previous working group last call. Addressing comments, as Ronnie said, I believe it is mainly editorial and clarifications, so no real technical changes. Sorry? You can expect the publication request fairly soon then, yes. Yeah. Paul? Yeah, we can see you, Paul. Welcome to talk.
I was questioning the update needed on 4566 BIS. I'm done waiting for comments basically at this point. I submitted an update a while ago, and the only thing I know there's one thing wrong with it now because there's a normative reference that ought to be informative, but that's the only thing I know about. I was sending another update for that until there was maybe something else.
Paul, just a question for clarification. It's Fleming. Are you looking for comments just to review what was done, or were there any open issues that you need feedback on or resolution? Okay. So as far as you're concerned, everything is done, and it's really up to people to comment if they have any issue. Okay, thank you.
If so, that is really good, because then I think we can actually go for publication requests even for that one. Thanks,
I've asked several times. When I made changes, I tweaked the ABNF to clean it up in some ways, and in the process of doing that, the TRZ or T whatever it is and Z stuff was a little whacked, and so I made a change in the syntax to make it more aligned with the semantics that has been documented. I'd just like to hear anybody, if anybody has any reason to believe that the revised syntax will invalidate anybody's usage, please say something. I mean, the basic thing that is it now, I've made it syntactically incorrect to use a Z equals without a R equals.
So anyone has any comments on that? I know you have asked on the list, but there wasn't much feedback. Right. Colin?
Hi, Colin Perkins. So my expectation is that won't be a problem because I don't think anyone is using it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think. It certainly doesn't apply to SIP.
I know when we did 4566, so 2326.7, whatever it was, BIS, we renamed some of the ABNF the variables in the ABNF, and people did complain about that. In this case, I think it's a sufficiently obscure thing, and I don't think things have been renamed. They've just been, something that was optional has been made mandatory or whatever it is. So I don't think it's going to be a problem.
I did rename some stuff. It was really funky. I renamed a few things to make them consistent with the way all the other lines are. So
yeah. So way back, I mean, this must have been about 2002 or something when we were doing 4566. There were complaints when we renamed bits of the ABNF. I think they came from 3GPP, but I may be wrong on that. It's been a long time, and I'd have to search back through the email to see who complained. So I suspect it's okay, and possibly we just want to last call it and send those people a liaison statement to say we're doing this, and if you really care, come and comment. It's not like a slow last call will cause any great problems given how long this has taken already.
Yeah. So for the note taker, just to be clear, so Colin, you're suggesting we should send a liaison to 3GPP and make them aware?
I mean, I think there are a bunch of people use SDP. So the fact that we're revising it, we probably want to send them a look. We think we're finished. We don't believe we've broken anything, but if you care that much, right. I don't know. Yeah.
So 3GPP and who else?
I don't know. Who uses this stuff?
I mean, like I said, this timing stuff is not relevant to SIP. So it has to be like people that are still using SAP or something.
Yeah. I mean, for the timing stuff, I suspect no one has used it in 20 years.
Right. And Paul, just to clarify, were there any other syntax changes to things that we think might be used by people?
I don't believe so.
Well, okay.
So in that case, we're probably okay.
All right. Thank you.
In that case, I believe we should go for publication request fairly soon. But if anyone has any objections or any comments or such, please state them to the list as soon as possible. So for the last draft there, the Mmusic ISIP SDP, we have that one on the agenda today. And there are a few other documents in the working group. We have the Mmusic MSRP usage data channel, where it was updated recently, but there were no reviews or very little interest in the group. So at this point in time, the chairs proposed to actually drop the milestone for this draft, since there seems to be no interest. And that also seems to be okay with the new author of the document. We can revive it if interest should reappear. Yeah, we will make that call on the list. And that it was actually mentioned on the list already, but we'll make sure to clear that, be very clear on the list for that. And the last draft there is the SDP UKS, which, as last meeting, still needs some more review. We had 3 drafts in SDP Directorate and Designated Expert Review. We had the BFCP BIS, which Paul helped review. We have the RTC Web SDP, where Fleming reviewed part of it, the section 5.4. And the security architecture identity attribute was reviewed by Krister.
Just going back to the unknown keys here draft. From the author's point of view, this draft is done. It has not gotten a whole lot of review. It's been announced to TLS and RTC Web as well, I believe it is. I have not followed what the status is there, but could we get maybe 1 or 2 people to volunteer to review it, preferably people that have some security knowledge? No need to look down, Jonathan. No need to look down. Any volunteers? Yeah. How about Adam? Is this something you could take a look at? It's pretty quick.
I'm definitely going to review this at some point.
Yeah. So
It's going to end up in the IFC.
I know.
Well, I might not do that, but
Sure, because I'm going to have to review it, it's not really any more work for me, but I can't guarantee any particular time frame.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And for this slide, we have used it in this working group for a while, clearly outlining what dependencies that we have to the RTC web. And this is starting to look very good, I believe. Most of them are in the RFC editors queue, and the only document here that is not already there, we have on the agenda today, and we have working group consensus for that one. But let's see what happens during the agenda point today. Apart from that, we are done with those. Yep. So with that, please come to the front, Christer. We go to the offer answer.
Okay, this is a presentation, a discussion that I really hope that we wouldn't have to do, but here we are. It's related to the describing of offer answer procedures when we define new attributes. There's no draft for this. I guess we'll see what the outcome of the discussion today is, whether it's going to be a new draft incorporated in some other draft, or we're not going to do anything. But the background is that, as we know, whenever someone defines a new attribute, as a new STP attribute, we've been pretty strict when we've done the STP directorate reviews and so on, that when you define the offer answer procedures, you should use this structure which we have in RFC 3264, which basically means that you're going to have these four chapters or subsections there, generating the initial offer, the answer, offer processing the STP answer, modifying the session. In some cases, you may even have then sections below this. For example, in bundle, we have a lot of subsections, but basically this is the main sections that you're supposed to have, and which we in most cases have. Now the problem is that, as you saw there on the previous slide, there is the one subsection which says generating the initial STP offer. Now this word initial has caused some problems. What it means. For example, if you look, there are basically two ways that people interpret it. I don't think we need to go up here and say what people's understanding is, but the problem is that first, some people say that this is the first offer within a session. And this is basically aligned with, for example, RFC 3261. The SIP says the initial offer is the first offer that you send within a session. Now, the other alternative, which at least in my opinion is how drafts, STP draft, attribute draft describe it, is the first offer within a session when this attribute is actually introduced. I mean, it could be the first offer of the session, but it could also be later in the session. Unless, of course, the attribute has a default value, in which case it will be in the first offer of the session, even if you don't put it there, it will be the implicit default value, but that's a special case. And of course, if you have multiple M lines, you could add as attribute to different M lines in different offers. You may have an audio line at some point, and you add the attribute there, and then later in the session you may add a new M line for video, and then you're going to have, you will add an attribute to that media or M line too. So this is a problem. However, I'm gonna show a couple of examples how we could solve this. But I think that the important thing is that we need to be able to distinguish between two things: the case or the offer when an attribute is added to an M, when it's first added to an M section, or if it has been removed at some point and later added again. And when it has previously been added and you send a subsequent offer, where you have two cases. Either you don't change the value of the attribute, it's whatever it was previously, or you modify it, or you remove it. Because when you modify it, there may be some rules associated with that. Removing it should be pretty simple. You just remove it. But there may be some implication or some procedures that you need to describe. There could, for example, be, just to take an example, this SDP identity attribute, which we have in RTC Web, which has a very, it's related to the fingerprint attribute. So for example, if you're removing that attribute, you would also have to remove the identity attributes and so on and so on. But basically the bottom line is that we need to separate between those cases. When you add it to an M section and when it's there, when you modify it. Now, there are two ways here. Maybe there could be three or more, but this is the way. First, the first solution is to just clarify what the initial offer means whenever you define a new attribute. This is actually what we did in bundle. So this text here is taken from bundle, from the initial offer section, which says that the procedures in the section apply to the first offer within an SDP session, e.g. a SIP dialog, blah, 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 in which the offer indicates that it wants to negotiate a given bundle group. This could occur in the initial offer or in a subsequent offer of the SDP session. So we really clarified it. So basically, I mean, maybe it could be worded better and so on, but basically we would need to have this text in whenever we define a new SDP attribute. I mean, it would be very, I mean, very simple to modify this text and to your favorite attribute, but this is how that would like. Can I give a second, present a second? Okay. The second solution is really to change the structure, not focus really on an initial offer or subsequent offer, but look it from the feature, from the attribute perspective. So basically, we would have this structure, which you see here in violet. The first section would be add attribute to a media description, or if it's a session level attribute to the SDP session. And then you have two subsections, send the offer when you do it and send the answer. We wouldn't really care whether this is the initial offer or whatever. This is the offer where you add this attribute to the session. And then you would have the second one, modify attribute or modify session, whatever. And then how you send the offer, and then you could have it unchanged, updated, removed, and so on, and answer. My personal, I think my suggestion is the alternative too, but I don't really have any strong opinion, so I'm not going to argue. If someone wants, if the community wants one, I'm fine with that. Or if someone has something else. Or if someone thinks we shouldn't do anything because it works, what we have now, it works fine. So I think maybe I'll comment at this point, because I think this is all I had to say. The rest is just the way forward. But in order to go there, we should maybe first try to agree on something. Thank you.
So Ben Campbell, as an individual, how many new SDP attributes do we expect to see once Cluster 238 is done?
Well, yeah.
Never enough?
I guess I should have clarified also. The intention is not really to start updating all the SDP attributes that we have. These are all for future attributes.
Right.
I mean, what we have today, we have, and you know, we'll if questions comes on the list, we'll fix that. But these are for new attributes.
So the
I'm not sure again.
I'm not sure we need it either. I'm asking. Yeah, I mean, Jonathan, I think that, I mean, clearly you can, if you get we have exciting echo. That's fun. If you get a, what was I saying? Sorry, distracted. If you get the, if you receive a check on the candidate for which you advertised MDNS, then it works. So the only question is whether you need to adjust the timing in some way such that, I guess, if in general, if you couldn't resolve the name for whatever reason, I feel like this is maybe a more general ICE issue or FQDN and ICE issue. If you couldn't resolve the name in general, do you then leave that slot out in the timing so as to keep the original schedule, or do you just skip over it because you're only sliding by 20 milliseconds anyway?
So it's true that resolution might take some time. So what you really want is to actually be able to explore all the routes in parallel. And if there's one that will finish earlier and it's not the optimal one, then so be it.
Yes, and I think what's also important to remember is that I send you my candidate with this, and you forever, maybe you can't resolve it or whatever, and you're gonna discard it. But of course, I don't know that you have discarded it, so I'm still going to use the candidate. When I start sending the checks to you, I'm still going to use that candidate, which is sent from my local host. Because I have no idea. I mean, that's how ICE work. I send you my candidates, and then I get your candidates, and I'm gonna make these pairs. Yeah. So you're going to use your local host candidate for sending checks to me. I guess maybe that's not which means that if there's no NAT or anything, then I will find about your IP address at that point. But maybe that's okay, because if I'm not behind a NAT, I guess my address is public anyway. So, but just to keep in mind.
Justin, you ready to go? The distinction is that the JS will never learn the private IP address. The browser will have to learn it just because it'll see like where those checks are coming from. But that's okay, because it's going to do the MDNS lookup anyway. It'll learn it, but the JS won't have access to it.
Jonathan, I actually feel like learning the address, if you're actually using it, is okay. The case we're worried about is learning the address when you weren't on the same subnet and you're not using it.
Right, but consider the case of like in a page that wants to basically connect a peer channel, or peer connection to itself, a data channel to itself. If it learns the address there, and like it's only making a little more work than what it has to do right now to learn that address.
John, another point I was going to make is I feel like if we were doing this in the context of trickle, the timing rules get a lot clearer, because basically you can treat when the DNS resolution is succeeding as though that candidate got trickled. I'm wondering if we can do some sort of like mini trickle logic here to describe what you do when the DNS succeeds or until it succeeds. Because I mean, clearly, if you had trickle, that's the logic you want.
Just to the original question from Colin, though, like you don't know if remote site supports IPv6 or not before you start sending it candidates, and so there's always going to be cases where like a candidate will just be discarded because it's like useless. And so same thing for MDNS. If you don't know how to handle these candidates, then you just have to skip over them. And like, I also just think that the timing, like the signaling channel has variable timing anyway. And so like you might have like a second latency through the signaling channel. Like that seems to not be an overall problem. So if it takes a little bit of time to resolve this name, I don't think that's the end of the world either. And Chris, related to trickle, maybe something we need to clarify there is that when we use the zip in for trickle, and you always have to, if you understand the content, you always have to reply with a 200 OK, which means that even if you're not able to resolve this, or even it's an IP version but you don't support, you still have to send 200 OK for. Maybe that's already in the trickle draft. I don't know, but again, you always accept the info.
Another problem, John. Another problem I was curious about is when you get a probe from the other side, and this comes in from, you know the the browser knows the IP address of the other side because that's on the packet. But he then doesn't know whether that matches a candidate in his candidate list or not. So how should he report this this candidate? I mean, if his candidate list contains blah 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 dot local, and the packet coming in comes from 192.168.0.5, and blah 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 dot local does not resolve. What is it?
Chris, this is exactly what I said earlier. In your internal tables, you need to use the IP addresses, because you use it, for example, when you make the table to make the foundations, and when you receive connectivity checks, you need the IP address to see whether this matches and something that you have and everything. So internally you must use IP addresses. So we need to redesign ICE again. But seriously, that.
So instead, do you surface it as a periflexive candidate or not? You have just revealed the IP address.
So yeah, there are really two layers. The layer from the JavaScript and above is clearly about names. And after you do the resolution there, you have a set of IP addresses that you will need to sort and use as the usual ICE algorithm.
Yeah, I agree with what Chris said. I think that answers my question from earlier too, which is what you need to do is think about this as an encrypted form of the IP address, and you do all the same things as if you had the IP address. Like from a timing point of view, it's just like you had an IP address. You can't just throw these away and skip past them if you can't resolve them or something. You need to treat them like you had an IP address that you couldn't resolve from a timing point of view. But it's just, I think it all works.
Right.
You just need to think about it as an encrypted form of the IP address.
The only tricky part is, of course, you need to have this encrypted version of the IP address at some level in the implementation. So in terms of implementation, you need the right abstraction there. That's only what is needed.
Jonathan Lennox. I mean, I think the interesting questions, which I think is sort of to what Harold was getting at, is what do you put in if you end up using this candidate for your connectivity, what do you put in the next offer answer from both sides? Do you still, does the person who offered this label still putting that in its candidates in its MC line, in its C line, and is the peer putting this in its C line, or is he just putting the regular IP address? Because forcing the peer to put this label in his C line and his single A equals candidate seems like suddenly a lot bigger burden. But if you don't do that, then you're leaking the IP address. And I mean, I feel like the threat model we're worried about here is people who are not on the local network finding out about your internal local network. When this person, you're trying to work correctly if you are on the same local network, but you don't want to advertise your internal structure to drive by JavaScript. And so I feel like if it actually did end up using this candidate, revealing the IP addresses in that case is not a problem, in my opinion. Because not doing that is really hard. In particular, you have to have not only his side, but the peer only ever use the MDNS label in its SDP.
So I haven't done the exercise of doing that implementation, so I cannot exactly judge the complexity. But hopefully, I would like that we would be able to preserve that privacy with having SDPs with only MDNS candidates if possible.
There's a lot more changes to the document.
I'm not quite sure that.
Yeah, Justin Brady, I don't think that there's anything in the document that prevents you from using FQDN in the CD line or anything like that. I mean, it's more work in the implementation for sure.
But nothing that prevents is not the same thing as requires. And you don't get privacy guarantees unless it requires. If every implementation has to say, if I was advertised in FQDN, I will only ever use that FQDN to mention that candidate ever.
Niels Olmeyer. I think, so I always thought when I read this proposal that it's only for the scenario that the signaling should not learn about my host candidates in case I never get connected. If you take that to the level of like, there is a connection and we want to reuse these candidates, I think then probably not for Mmusic, but in general, it would create a lot more problems, because then what do you do about get stats? We have like ICE candidates in there, you need to use then the MDNS names in there and stuff like that. So
Exactly.
that makes the whole thing like a lot more problematic if you want to insist that the MDNS names need to be reused everywhere publicly, or however you call that, basically outside of your implementation.
But of course, now to argue against myself, it's really not hard to set up two peer connections in the same context and set up a data channel to yourself.
Exactly. Right. But I mean, to be clear, the actual candidate is the FQDN. And so that's what should appear in the stats regardless. Like, I think there's a weird race condition here you have to worry about, which is what happens if you get a packet before your MDNS resolution succeeds.
Right.
Then you have a peer reflexive candidate from that local IP, and you can have like this timing condition that results in that leaking. And that's something that has to be dealt with, and like probably isn't in this document, but this probably back in the IP handling document. But that's the only thing I can think of that isn't just work, that actually requires something to be solved.
I actually disagree, because that highly like where you get the information for get stats and that stuff from highly depends on your implementation details.
I mean, yes, but the get stats, you're supposed to report the local and remote candidate. And so if the candidates are MDNS names, then they should be exposed to JS as MDNS names.
It's true that there's some, in the spec, in the WebRTC stat specs, there's an IP field which should be changed to candidate name field or whatever.
Like nobody uses like FQDNs today. So like I can tell you that in Firefox, I'm pretty sure that the stats get generated out of like whatever the ICE stack says is the IP address, because there's simply no support for FQDNs.
Yeah, Chris, I think what you have to put in the C line is, as the current spec says, is that this is the address that should be used if you don't support ICE. If the remote endpoint doesn't support ICE, doesn't support the candidates, then in the C line, and yes, you can put FQDN in the C line, or I don't think that's forbidden.
That's why we have this here, because
Unless, of course, you use trickle, where you could put this 0, 0, 0, 0, whatever. But if you, in case you don't use trickle, I don't know if that needs a note there saying that, yeah, this should also be put in the C line. I don't know, but maybe a good clarification. Because I think the case we want to avoid is that a bad implementation, yes, they put this in the candidate, but then they still put the IP address in the C line. And
Sure.
or like I said,
So my feeling there was that it would be good to have guidelines for implementation, and then people will do what they can do with it, and hopefully we will follow the guidelines.
if your goal is for this to be privacy preserving, it needs to be stronger than guidelines. It needs to be mandatory implementation.
They're not allowed.
Yeah. But the other thing that I'm concerned about is the thing that's not highlighted on the slide, the fact that it says 6724 procedures, which really makes this much more confusing to me, because that basically says what you do if your DNS query returned multiple IP addresses, and which remote IP address you use depends on which candidate you're sending from, and that kind of makes my head explode, especially in terms of matching up peer-reflexive addresses. So I don't know how to implement that at all.
So I looked a little bit at the rules from section 6, but I haven't done the full exercise to make them work like in a real example.
Yeah, but people, I mean, they're complicated rules, but basically what it says, it's basically given that a DNS query returned a set of IP addresses, which one you send to depends on what you're sending from. So how you can have that kind of means that you have a candidate whose IP address is different depending on what it's paired with. And that makes my head completely explode.
But Jonathan, isn't this a problem with DNS candidates already?
Yes, this is not new for MDNS,
Yeah.
but it is new for the the rule, I mean, it's already bad for this, but if we're going to impose this rule that this address must always be, that candidate must always be represented by its name, how do I determine what's that candidate when there's a set of IP addresses it could be depending on what candidate you're talking to?
Yeah, I agree. It's a bigger issue with DNS, especially for MDNS. Hopefully, on the generation side, you will take one IP address and one local name, and so that on the resolution side, it hopefully will be simpler. But anyway, on implementation, we'll need to handle the case where there will be an FQDN name, no matter DNS or MDNS, and then handle the case where there will be several potential IP addresses.
Anyway, though, I agree that this sort of text about the rules of 6724, like I tried reading it the other day. It's actually quite confusing, like just in the general case. I sent a mail to the ICE working group list and haven't received response back. I think that just needs to be clarified in general. But what I'd like to try to sort of hone in here is, what do we want UN to do? Like, what of the green text, do we want to see changed, if anything? I think that just generally saying that it can be MDNS in addition to DNS is all that we're asking for this spec to change. There's a host of things to change, maybe in terms of like best practices for making this work and IP handling. But for here, I guess, is there anything else we want to see? Adam Roach is an individual. I largely agree with that. There is one caveat that ties back to something that was just said, which is if we want to make the assertion that an MDNS name corresponds one-to-one with an IP address, we are going to need to say that in here. Because like normal behavior right now, when I'm at home, I have machines that are like foo.local. If I'm on a v4 only machine and go to foo.local, I do it over v4. If I'm on a v6 cable machine, go to foo.local, it's going to hit a v6 address. So by default, MDNS typically works on both of those. And you're matching that up, if we don't otherwise say, with v4 candidates and v6 candidates, it'll match both, unless we constrain it.
Sure. On generation side, we can say in the world of WebRTC that you should do that. But a JavaScript may do whatever they want with generating whatever candidates they want. They can send that to the other side, and then the other side will need to handle this case of multiple potential IP addresses for one name.
I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. When you say the JavaScript, these are generated by the browser and handed to the JavaScript.
Yeah, and the JavaScript can talk with whatever native application to know some MDNS names that would actually resolve to several IP addresses. So in the general case, implementations will need to handle, like for DNS.
Okay, I think that's going to require a lot more text in whatever describes the ICE handling around this, right? To talk about the fact that this could correspond to multiple addresses and how to deal with that.
Yeah, it's trying to do that. I think that it's not very clear or precise just because it was very lightly implemented.
So this is the ICE SDP document we're talking about changing, right? So I think we do need to discuss, I'm in favor of this sort of change, this looks fine, but I think there's also needs to be text that discusses backwards compatibility with this. So outside of the WebRTC context, no existing offer answer clients that do ICE support MDNS that I'm aware of.
Outside of the WebRTC world, there's no use of data channel, I guess. And it's mostly audio, video, which makes it a bit easier.
How does that make it easier? This everything you're talking about 100% applies to when I'm only doing audio video with no data channel, right?
Well, if you're with a browser, usually you have get user. Well, some implementations have a switch based on get user media whether to use MDNS or not.
Right. So I'm talking about things that aren't browsers and aren't WebRTC. None of them are going to do this. And that doesn't mean I think we should ban it or anything like this. Like none of them do like very few of them do fully qualified domain lookups either, okay? But I think we need to discuss that in the document. And we need to have some considerations of when you put in a DNS name and when you don't, and the pros and cons of that. And it doesn't limit it anything way you want to do. I think we just need some text there that helps explain it for non-web browser or non-WebRTC use cases.
So
which spec would you recommend there? Because it seems like guidelines or...
I mean, I think it should be in the this draft, the SDP. I mean,
Okay.
This is generic advice to people who are writing ICE SDP. about when they use this. Now, and it would point at, if you're a web browser, you need to go read Justin's documents and things that come out of it, right? But in the non-WebRTC use cases, we probably need a little bit of advice to say, if you just start putting this stuff in, it's not going to work, right?
Yeah.
That's basically it.
So just one, there's one, in the actual cases we're talking about, they would only put MDNS names in if you didn't call get user media, which say almost certainly for data channel, where so it's not interop with, non-web browsers is not a consideration anyway. Obviously, that's probably not stuff that's not defined, not what do I want to say? Not stuff that's not reading the RTC web documents. Hopefully, but or probably not stuff that's not using libWebRTC. What?
I don't think that's true for IoT stuff where we're off on travel.
Yeah, well, IoT stuff is probably using a stripped down version of libWebRTC, so libWebRTC implements this. And they actually update IoT stuff, haha, we're good. So, but, obviously that's, hey, these corner cases happen to line up nicely with each other. It is not in the general case. Yeah, it's sort of this weird case of, this is definitely a what is the must, but we know you won't support problem. Or at least must, but we know you didn't.
Let's be clear. There's no must support for DNS at all in the current document.
Just to be clear, I'm in favor of changing it to allow MDNS for the initial advertising, basically as a protection against the data channel abuse thing we all have in our mind. But in terms of reusing it, what do we do if I receive a binding request and I learn that as a peer reflexive, and God forbid there's the other end basically learns that way as well, that his host candidate is being netted locally, and then how do you match up then an MDNS name? I'm pretty sure we can come up with some bizarre scenarios where you receive a stun binding request first, and then you get your trickle candidates later, and then I have no idea how the iStack should figure out how to match up these. In the good scenario, your MDNS will luckily resolve exactly to the IP address and port number you received the stun binding request from, but if that doesn't align, then you're basically screwed. Then you can only put in the IP address and port numbers in these cases. So yeah, I think the idea of keep using the MDNS names in subsequent reoffer reanswer things is that probably needs more thinking and more discussion.
Just you ready? This is, I think, one of the reasons why Ted suggested we move this to a different spec rather than dumping this all into IP handling. Yeah, I think there are some things that have to be figured out, and that peer reflexive case is definitely one of them. But to Colin's point, though, would you be okay with just having some text that says, note that, some clients will not support FQDNs, and they are free to ignore. They will be free to ignore these candidates.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not trying to change anything you're doing. Just some warning labels in there for non-WebRTC use cases. And Adam points out that I was wrong about the current draft. Actually says you should do DNS. I guarantee that doesn't work if you follow the spec. Yeah, DNS. Yeah.
And you use IP addresses that's not available.
Yeah.
But look, all I'm asking for is a little bit of warning text. I'm glad to help write it. It's not, you just asked what are the changes we need to make to the document. I think we need a little bit more than this, but nothing that is onerous to what you're trying to do.
Okay, probably there's a GitHub repo for it, and then we can work on the PR there.
Yeah. To the other point, the point about 6724, this is actually something I want to still, not to you but to whoever the editors are of ISIP SDP. Who's that?
Suans.
Okay, who's not even in the chapter. But yeah, I think this change, 5245 said basically if you do an FQDN lookup, you pick one IP address, v6 if you have it, v4 otherwise. And that's changed to use the 6724 rules. And I I think I remember that going by and sort of nodding, saying, yeah, I guess that kind of makes sense in the past, but now I'm looking at that and somewhat alarmed. So we might want to revisit that.
Chris, just a question maybe that would avoid all of this. What if just don't signal your these kind of candidates, but later you start sending checks from them and the remote endpoint is going to create peer reflexive candidates and you're done?
At least one side has to send host candidates for that to work, doesn't it?
You don't need to send host candidates, but you start sending checks from your host candidate, and a remote pair, if it receives it, is going to create a peer reflexive.
But this is going to be hairpinning at best, isn't it?
I don't know, but it's so you start sending them to where? When I send my candidates to you, I only send my server reflexive and whatever that don't have any privacy issues, and you're going to send your candidates back to me. Then we create the pairs, and you know, we use those pairs to send candidates. But then when I do send, if there is no NAT, when I start sending checks to you, you will create a pair reflexive candidate. Yeah, but if it doesn't work, this is not going to work.
No, because Jonathan, that will work if hairpinning is working, because you'll bounce off your some server and go back to the other guy, and that's great. But the reason why we're doing all this is because they determined that hairpinning, you know, there are many white, you know, many NAT boxes sold by the same companies as sell the browsers, which do not do hairpinning properly.
Just ready. This is not really relevant to this thing, but it is relevant to the overall problem of, okay, imagine your web page wants to gather addresses. You can then omit the MDNS candidates, and then if hairpinning succeeds, you might actually then be able to then see the source address of like these local candidates that will be created as peer reflexive, and maybe get access to the private addresses that way. So like this is a complicated problem. Well, let's assume that in these pages will open data channels themselves. Once we take away the front door, let's try the back door, and then like if it's possible to remove the MDNS thing, and then like that would cause perhaps these IP addresses to come up naturally. We have to sort of figure out how to mask that too. Anyway, this is really not germane to this thing, which is like a very focused piece of text, which I'd still like us to move forward with Colin's suggestion.
All right. I think it's time for us to try to summarize where we're at with everything. There's been a lot of discussion at this point. So I'm not sure we have it quite right up here. So let's try to go through it, one by one. In terms of actually supporting MDNS, which I guess is the request that you guys came with, if I understand the sentiment of the room correctly, I mean, people are in favor of doing that. However, there is some details to be worked out as to exactly what does that mean. Is it just for the initial, offer, or is it beyond that? Am I understanding that correctly? All right, so more work seems to be needed there for sure, right?
Jonathan, I mean, I think for this document, as opposed to IP handling, whether it's for, I mean, this all ICE says is you may put an MDNS name in if you feel like it, and I think it's is that you just want to do that for the initial offer? Do you want to do it for subsequent? That's much more in the domain of IP handling in RTC Web, because that's just finding the policy of when you do or don't do that.
So you don't think ISIP STP should say anything about that?
No, just basically you may put an FQDN, including MDNS FQDN, as the candidate if you feel like it.
Okay. And everybody in this room is okay with that?
Adam Roach, individual. Yes, I think there needs to be clarity about whether you're required to process these, and I suspect the sentiment would be no. So required to actually attempt to contact it, right? I mean, certainly you have to parse it, but do you need to act on it, or are you mandating MDNS support? I don't think that's realistic. To be clear, if we are, then we need a must in here somewhere.
And look, all of this is, in my mind, contingent on the fact that doing this doesn't create a DDoS vulnerability attack, which I'm not arguing it does, but I think that I'm arguing is one of the things we need to look at quite seriously at the ICE level before we go forward with all this. It's not exactly an SDP issue, it's an ICE issue.
I like just to split the issue in two parts.
Yeah.
One is there's a DNS mechanism, and we're just proposing to do, hey, there's this DNS mechanism. It should also include MDNS.
Okay, but MDNS is not DNS. What you're trying to say is we should extend this to use DNS, and I'm great with that as long as it doesn't make a security vulnerability. And I'm working on the assumption you will be completely correct that it doesn't, but that assumption needs to be checked before this is published.
If I may. Yeah, to remote individual. So I think the issue that you have applies more to the IP handling proposal that's out there as opposed to this, because this is just saying, use MDNS. It very well could be your foo.local name, but this is not anything to do with the UID mechanism. This isn't saying push stuff out proactively. This is like, you're a host, you might have an MDNS name. That's fair, use it. Or you might generate it via some other mechanism. When we turn around and start saying we're going to generate these things on the fly and push them out in a way that might destroy the network, that's when we have to get concerned about it. But I don't think this document applies.
Look, it's fair enough, but it's using them in ICE. It's not the IP. The IP handling document is about what you pass up to the JavaScript in a browser. It has, like, imagine we weren't doing anything with web browsers. We're only going to do MDNS with SIP endpoints. The DDoS thing still exists. So it's not the IP handling document that needs to discuss this. It's the ICE usage of it, which I agree is not this document.
Right. Describe what the issue there is. The fact that you're sending these queries out on a local network, or is it that you're publishing the names?
The fact that you're putting a very large number of these out and they're changing very rapidly. And I can send invites to you that cause an incredible amount of multicast traffic. Now, that may turn out when we do the math to be no big deal at all, not very much multicast traffic, but it might not.
So you're talking about the mechanism of generating large numbers of these names, which this is not predicated on.
MDNS lookup.
It's not a problem with this document. It's a problem with the usage of this in ICE.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think the issue is you take JavaScript and you send like forge MDNS candidates to
I don't
everybody,
take JavaScript.
and then
I take
if
a
it's
SIP
going,
phone with invites and I send 1,000 invites into the enterprise and watch what happens next.
Oh, because each one of those is going to have a different name in them because you've decided as an attacker to do so. Okay, I see the problem now. Thank you.
Jonathan, I'm not enough an MDNS expert. Does the MDNS query cause multicast traffic, or does MDNS advertisement cause multicast traffic, or both?
Both.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. The other thing I think we do need to figure out for, I guess for this, because this is where you're saying you can use FQDN, because the ICE-BIST core does not, is exactly how DNS lookups affect timing. Are you required to do all your DNS lookups before you start connectivity checking? Or are you allowed to do, that would be a bad answer.
Yeah.
I would rather that not be the answer, but if you're not, then the timing issues come into play as to what happens, either if you don't have the result yet when that candidate pair slot comes up, or what happens if the lookup fails.
Sure.
Which is, I think, related to the thing that Cullen was saying, where I don't support MDNS is a subset of the lookup failed.
And Jonathan, to be clear, the timing issue, is that something that would be handled in this document, or is that in another document
I
as well?
don't know, because it's the weird thing is it's this document that's mentioning FQDNs at all.
Right.
The ICE core does not. I would really rather not have both those documents in major surgery at this point, given that they're blocking for plus 238.
Yep.
But I kind of feel like it's FQDNs interact interestingly with the core ICE spec.
Bernard Above, Microsoft. Having been intimately involved with MDNS from the beginning, it's important for people to understand that this is an inherently link local mechanism that is using an MDNS name to represent an address that is not link local scope will inevitably cause introduction of failures that would not otherwise occur. So, we're talking about private addresses. If the peers are not on the same link local scope, right? This will actually cause changes to what happens in ICE, and you will have connectivity failures that would not have otherwise occurred. So I'm a little bit, I can certainly see appropriate strictures in which this will be okay, but I can also see a lot of cases which there would be additional failures, and the ICE mechanism could potentially. No, it's core ICE. It's core ICE.
That's what I keep saying. IP handling has nothing to do with SIP endpoints.
Right.
So it's not an IP handling issue. And that is the point. It needs to be dealt with somewhere. So where are we going to deal with it? And I'm not arguing this is the right document.
Sure, and it's true that there are differences between MDNS and DNS that we should also study precisely.
Justin Uberti. Bernard, what are the failures you're concerned about? Because certainly any like candidate that's like a host candidate might not be reachable like in a remote peer, and so that would be a failure that would be experienced anyway. And so I'm not sure how an MDNS effort that doesn't resolve.
So as an example, like in an enterprise network, I've seen enterprise networks that use net 10 in a routed way, right? So if you were to have two net 10 addresses on separate networks, that ICE connectivity check would normally pass. You substitute MDNS names, now they're link local scope, they aren't on the same network, so now that connectivity check will fail.
Agreed.
Now it's true that, yeah, they would end up using a turn server or, you know, stun or whatever, but that's a check that should pass because they do have connectivity.
Right, but that doesn't seem relevant to this document there. That's kind of a guide for like, if you replace host candidates with MDNS names, like some things that could connect won't.
So what document is that relevant to?
Yeah, they're not dynamic.
That seems like the choice of MDNS at all, IP handling, it seems entirely germane to.
But I think it's fair at least to warn implementers about that.
So let me get it just so there's lots of enterprises. So let's talk about how this is going to work out in large enterprises. So lots of large enterprises, and look, you know where I'm going with this, whatever, right? And I'm not saying this is a reason not to do it, but I'm saying it's a reason we need to consider when and where to do it. Is large enterprises, many of them have flat IP addresses across over 200,000 hosts. That's a fairly normal requirement for switches these days. And they are certainly not broadcasting MDNS over a 200,000 host domain. I don't know how big they go, but it's not that big.
Because you're not interested in the printers in the other side of the country.
Right. So all the MDNS proxies, particularly the ones in the wireless access points, which are going to severely rate limit the bandwidth of this on most large enterprise deployments. I mean, we're going to have places where in the current things we would have had connectivity, and now we won't. Now, the thing that makes me feel better about that is the thing my friend Justin always reminds me is, yes, but if you get media first, none of this matters, right? Yeah. And so that makes me chill out a lot. But I think that type of stuff needs to be a little bit discussed somewhere. And I view it primarily as an ICE issue. It's not an SDP issue. It's not a Mmusic issue. But it's also not exactly an IP handling issue. It's an issue to do with the fact that we're allowing MDNS to be used in ICE. I think we need to discuss that somewhere. Now we have a separate issue, which is what addresses get filtered and sent up into JavaScript, and I view that totally as the IP handling document. But using MDNS in ICE has some interesting considerations. I'm probably in favor of it, but we need to work through those in detail somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, one reason why there's kind of disconnect here is the assumption in ICE proper always was, you know, advertise every address you've ever heard of. There's no such thing as a privacy issue. And the privacy issues things only really came in with WebRTC, and that's where you start having these policy questions of which candidates do or don't you advertise, which this is a subset / related topic to. So we don't have anywhere that discusses that outside of IP handling because it never was an issue before. Now, obviously, you know, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's not an issue outside the browser context because everywhere else, you know, if you are the thing using the ICE stack, you can find out all the IP addresses and do whatever you want with them. It's only this weird trust separation between JavaScript and browser that this becomes an issue.
Justin, you ready? So what I'm hearing is that we might want a document that basically describes how to use MDNS with ICE that's really separate from like, can you actually put MDNS in a candidate, or MDNS name in a candidate? I mean, I would suggest we still move forward with this change, and then as part of like the work we have with IP handling, we try to come up with said document.
Yeah, I'd support that.
All right, so just to be clear, even though it sounds like people don't necessarily understand the implications of actually using MDNS, let alone how it would be done, people are okay with adding a sentence that says you can use MDNS at this point?
Justin, you ready? I disagree with the premise that we don't understand how it would be done or the possible side effects. I think we do, and we do have a place where we are going to write this down. We just don't have, everything kind of detailed at RFC level yet.
Same difference, in my book, but whatever.
Yeah, I think we should just write a blank check for the stuff we don't know yet, but I'm still okay with that.
In any case, given that we've already, since you could argue that this existing spec already supports this usage because, dot and local name is FQDN, clarifying that is not doing any harm.
And it's true also that DNS usage needs to be clarified as well, probably.
Right. Yeah, I think the second edition here is, sorry, Adam Roach again, individual. I think the second paragraph here is pretty uncontroversial. The first one I think is probably going to cause us to put probably a fairly large paragraph in the security considerations section that addresses the issue that Colin has raised about potentially being able to, from an external perspective, flood an enterprise's multicast network. And we probably just need something along the lines of, the clients receiving these probably want to have some sort of leaky bucket approach to sending the requests out and, stop after a certain point.
Yeah, John, thanks. I mean, I would, at the very least, don't send a DNS query for a candidate which you're throwing out of the candidate pair for being too many candidate pairs.
Right. I'm more concerned about the case that Colin specifically illustrated, which is that I've sent you 1,000 invites, and those are like 1,000 device sessions, right? And so you need to have basically a system-wide, or almost like a network-wide, which you could do because it's multicast and you'll see everyone else's, limit to how frequently these things are sent out.
Yeah, and I think the other issue we could figure out related to it is, the timing of being necessary that's not I don't know. I mean, I kind of feel like all things equal wouldn't be, but given that this is the document that introduces the concept, that CDNs for ICE candidates, not for ICE, I think it has to be. That's probably also easier for I don't know what the right answer is, other than not, if we don't have a criminal concept. If you have a criminal concept, when a DNS decision happens, don't have to but introducing that in this document.
I'm going to try to summarize them. I'm not sure I'm going to say the same things that are so I'm hearing people in favor of including MDNA support in this. What I'm not clear on is whether the text that's here or being proposed, that people are okay with that, and certainly that is sufficient. My read is it's not sufficient because I'm not sure exactly what that is, but most.
I would say that more text is needed about FQDNs, whether or not we have this text. We'll get there.
I didn't participate in the discussion. Okay. I mean, what I got from few of these is that maybe good explanation. The second paragraph is okay. The first paragraph requires some more text in the security situation. There's the issue of the timing, which Jonathan does not use, but not sure where it should be. I think that's the major issue.
Justin Brady. Colin also suggested that we have some text regarding what happens, or just noting that some candidates might not support DNS, or some clients might not support DNS.
Right. And then to Jonathan's point, right, this is not just for MDNS, right? There's also an issue with DNS names in general. How do we deal with those?
I think Ronnie characterized it properly.
Maybe it's the same thing that my original comment was also that we expand this text when you discard it. It's not only you don't support the IP version, but it's also if you aren't able to resolve whether it's DNS or
Here's the point taken for the suggestion that we tried for a second, which is I wonder really whether we should remove from this current spec all DNS and say that defines how this works with DNS. And we have how DNS works with ICE, we have how DNS works with this, and we have, including multitask DNS, and we have how multitask DNS works with handling as basically those elements of the documents that all go forward together, but not as part of what they're communicating.
Justin Verdi. I felt like that what Ronnie had characterized, summarized, we probably could fill in the blanks in a meaningfully finite period. A couple weeks. It seemed like we basically knew the outlines of what we could write. We just need to write it down and get people to come to contact about it. I feel like the actual, here's the behavior we need for DNS and ICE, is a longer sort of thing. And I'm reluctant to couple these that I consider fairly surgical changes to what could be a longer effort. If that's what we decide we actually need, if the IP handling stuff is going to be a longer track item too. But I was hoping that at least this part, even with the additional things that Ronnie captured, we could do and actually have very short.
Adam Roach. So I'm actually a little more in favor of splitting this out, I think, predominantly because I suspect once we get into the two issues that we described, we're going to get to the edges of those and we're like, let's use this. There's this other thing. And we're going to end up at a point where it's a non-trivial effort that does delay this document non-trivial. And specifically because the follow-on work for IP handling that relies on this is a separate item that's going to take a little bit of time as well. I think it probably doesn't cause any harm to that mechanism. And I'd like to make sure we get this right. And we just came up with this, and over the course of an hour, expanded parenthesized 5 words into probably 5 or 6 paragraphs already. And that's a reasonable size for a draft. If that's all it takes and we're done, good. I don't think that's what's going to take.
Bernard, I second Adam's concern here, because I can see, this was just a May originally, which maybe anticipated some very small amount of usage. If it's going to be used on a large scale, there's lots of corner cases that can happen, even in DNS with dynamic registration. There are corner cases which could happen, include things like dynamic registration where the underlying addresses change, and then understanding what the DICE implementation is supposed to be there, the caching and so forth.
Justin Verdi. Okay, I can get on behind that. What would we do? With the text then, given that the 5245 already says FTP are possible and you can, here's the procedure for doing like DNS, what would we do and what we actually publish from this draft?
Colin, you want to respond?
I mean, my proposal is whatever text is currently there clearly doesn't work if we go and actually test any running code, and actually is probably really short on a lot of topics. I wonder if in this thing we should just carve a clear carve out. It's just like for the purposes of this draft right here, how this works with FQDNs is not discussed whatsoever. That will be dealt with in draft X and a pointer to it. And if it's a 2-page draft that is finished 2 weeks from now, I will do a dance by Justin Scotch or something. I mean, I don't know that this needs to slow things down at all is what I'm trying to say.
All right. Sorry, Ronnie, go ahead.
So just for the notes again. I understood that what you're talking about is that you need some general text about not only MDNS, but also about the DNS and FQDNs in general, because they're not discussed, that should be a separate document. That's what I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, no matter what the current specifications say, they don't actually tell you enough to implement FQDNs, and though they say it is a should, it's a should that everyone took as a must not in the actual implementations. And that we should just reflect reality on this one and just say, we're punting this issue, right? This document deals with IP addresses, and we're punting FQDNs to the next document, which will correctly deal with both DNS and MDNS.
So again, for clarification here, this doesn't prevent from doing this steps.
It would.
So if it does, so who's going to write this document that needs to address?
Sure, Justin will. So any more comments from anybody on this? Then we'll just take this.
So
one
that is
off the room.
RFC 5245, right? Which is already introducing FQDNs. And then
But
we have,
nobody implemented it, is the point.
okay, so we remove something.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the other, what I sort of say is, to my previous point about trickle, if you, I mean, pushing it out to a separate document could mean that in fact you define the DNS resolution procedure in terms of trickle, which probably makes the state machines a lot easier. Because then you basically just say, treat the DNS resolution coming in as though that candidate were trickled.
Chris, just a generic comment. I think we should start talking about RFC 5245 because that's going to be replaced by RFC 8445 very soon. Actually, that's part of cluster. So it's going to take a while, but it's basically auth48 and everything is done. So, and that's ICE-BIS, the new version of ICE. So I think that's also what this document is referencing. So I think we should.
Yeah, I don't think that actually then, that's actually a good point, that because 8245 does not mention FQDNs at all, that ICE-BIS does not mention FQDNs at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we have a proposal here basically to say that ICIP SDP should not get into this whole DNS business, and we can come up with a separate document afterwards that will. I think that was Colin's proposal. I'd like to just get a sense of the room. Go ahead.
Yes, and I think the chairs and the AD should discuss maybe with the ICE chair whether that should be done here or there, because I mean, is it a ICE specific or is SDP? I mean, is it ICE generic or STP's ICE specific?
Yeah. But going back again, I like to just understand from the room if people are in favor of Colin's proposal, which is to say ICIP SDP will not deal with domain names at this point. We can come up with a separate document that does, but for now there will be no domain name procedures in there. I'd like to hear who's in favor of that and who's not. So if you're in favor of that proposal, please come now. If you're against that proposal, please come now. All right, so I think that's pretty. Yeah, so basically what we're going to do is ICIP SDP will not define any procedures for domain names, whether they are regular domain names, MDNS, whatever they are. There will most likely be a separate document coming out that will start getting into that. There will be MDNS. There will probably be domain name clarification in general, I would imagine. But we'll see whatever that document covers. And we will have a discussion, I guess, then with you and or the ICE chairs as to where does that go. And then we'll figure that out once we see the document. All right. All right, that's all we have on the agenda. Anybody else have anything? All right, if not, we'll see you guys next time. Thank you. Yep, sounds good. Thanks, Ron. Thank you.
think might be the local address. They don't have to look at it. But the problem is, it has a real address, doesn't also. That's the answer.